Hello, good morning, everyone. Am I loud and clear? Okay, great. So can I get a hello or good morning in the chat from you, Zoom chat as well as the YouTube chat? Okay, great. So welcome everyone to today's industry talk, and it is a pleasure for me to introduce you to today's guest, Oliver Fontana. So he has been joining us from all the way from Australia, and we are grateful to have him here. So Oliver is currently the head of analytics at Patties Food and has been a data science consultant across various companies. Today he will be talking about how real world businesses can leverage the power of data science to grow. Many businesses today are becoming data driven. Many businesses today are becoming data driven. So what are some of the key aspects that need to be focused on to achieve that goal? Oliver will be talking about them today, and he will also give some brief overview of his journey in data science. Welcome, Oliver. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's good to be here. This will be a bit of a visual presentation, so I'll have a slide deck up on the screen momentarily, but it is also a little bit interactive. If you'd like to ask questions inside the chat, I may or may not answer them while we're going through this presentation, depending on how good of a question it is. But there will be either way a 15-minute Q&A session at the very end of the chat. So that'll be at around about 3:15. Without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. Let me know if in the chat that you're seeing this very well. All right, actually I've got this open on the other screen. I can see not the correct screen. All right, this happens every time. All right, so just confirming you can see the presentation and nothing else funny going on with the screen. Very good. All right. The topic of this talk is engaging businesses with data science. This is all about not just performing actual analytics or creating machine learning algorithms or creating visualizations, but actually engaging with business users and the people who are actually going to be using the results of your analytics moving forwards. To make sure that they're across the situation as you develop it, they can give you feedback on what you're doing, and that they can make the most use of what you actually output from the end. A little bit of a background on myself. So I started out mostly doing programming and ended up landing straight into data science out of university. My first role was in PwC as an analytics consultant. And from there, I continued working in consulting all the way up until just quite recently, for the last 7 years or so. So this was in PwC, my own small freelancing consultancy for a couple of years, and eventually a consulting firm called Rubik's, where I worked as a client director, ultimately responsible for about 30 odd consultants across a number of our clients. That involved a lot of management of analytics projects, but also many discussions with clients along with presentations and planning for activities that are going to be happening in the future. I do currently work as the head of analytics at Patties Foods, which is somewhat of a recent change for me. I've been there for about a month and a half, which I'm enjoying quite a lot. But this will be mostly about project-based data science from the consulting side of things. This doesn't mean you need to be a consultant to actually get something out of this, but it is going to be focused on the more project-oriented way of doing things, which you can do individually. To do this, we're going to have a few different outcomes from this session. So the first thing we're going to do is understand how we can approach data and analytics, generally speaking, so just how you actually begin your work. The next thing we'll go through is an understanding of what your role as a data scientist should actually be. And lastly, we'll be looking at understanding the key components of successful business engagement. So we'll be tying all these three concepts together as we go through this presentation. The actual agenda is going to start with understanding our role. So in order to understand our role, I'll put a bit of a definition up on the screen, and then we're going to work through a couple of fun examples of how you can actually work through a data problem, but importantly, how you can actually present it in different ways to get different outcomes. Secondly, we'll be going through the engagement side of things. So what are the components of a successful engagement? And then eventually the practical advice for achieving these as well. So this is all geared towards practical things you can do to try and improve both your analytics capability, but also your engagement with any given business. It's worth noting that if you don't work in the data realm or you're just watching this out of your own interest, you will still get something out of it, particularly if you receive the results of analytics at any point in your role, whether you have people who create reports working with you, or you look at dashboards, or you just like talking with the people who work with data in your business. There's absolutely a lot to learn from working through some of the common examples of stumbling blocks when performing analytics and some of the methods of engagement that a data analytics professional will actually use in a business. First things first, 2 facts. So these 2 facts are going to underpin everything we talk about, and they will pop up again and again in the slides to come. The first one of these facts is that data is meaningless without context. There is no point in looking at any piece of data if you don't understand why you're looking at it and what the actual context of that piece of data is in the real world. If you see the number 5 on your screen, it means nothing unless someone tells you that's, say, how old their son is, or it's how many years they've been working in a business. It means nothing without that context of what the value actually means. And similarly, a category doesn't mean anything unless you understand what the other categories are and how they interact with the rest of the data. Getting that context is one of the underpinning principles of being a data scientist. The second fact is that people in general are natural analysts, not just data scientists themselves, but everyone in general in the world. We're all natural analysts. We all try to understand the world around ourselves. We all try to bring in information and read data from the various sources we can get it from. We all try to connect it up to the things we experience in real life in order to make sense of what's happening. These 2 things together do underpin everything that you will do as a data scientist in the industry, and it's worth remembering them. So they'll pop up again as we move forward in this presentation. First things first, though, understanding your role. What is your role as a data scientist? As a data scientist, the bottom line is your role is to interpret and guide. I'll go into more detail about what this is. You can consider this a placeholder screenshot until we get to the latest slide. But I want you to keep in mind that your role is to interpret information and to guide the business. To demonstrate this, we're going to talk about sunscreen to start with. This is the first of our 2 worked examples we're going to be going through. Sunscreen, as you all know, blocks ultraviolet light from reaching your skin to avoid sunburn. I know that everyone has to deal with that as much, but for me personally, it's a constant issue in my life, and I have to wear sunscreen when I go outside. You've got SPF 15 and you've got SPF 30. There's also SPF 50, but we won't talk about it at the moment. That's sun protection factor 15 versus 30. Now, 30 is the recommended one generally for going out and about, but of course you can wear 15 and you can go all the way up to 50. So which one should you be wearing? This is a general question that does get asked quite a bit. So we're going to start breaking this down with a couple of calculations here. Nothing too complicated. To start with, what do they actually do? Well, SPF 15 blocks 93% of ultraviolet light from hitting you. We'll just say it blocks 93% of sunlight. SPF 30 blocks 97%. So if we do a little bit of a calculation there, subtract 93 from 97, we find that there is a 4% increase in the blocking power at a raw level when you move from SPF 15 to SPF 30. Doesn't sound very impressive, but we could take a different angle on this. What if we instead looked at it from the perspective of, well, how much ultraviolet light does it actually let through? So we just look at it from the completely opposite direction. Well, if we assume we're starting from letting all of the sunlight through, 100%, then we can subtract 93 for SPF 15 and 97 for SPF 30, which means SPF 15 is allowing 7% of sunlight to come through, whereas SPF 30 is allowing 3% of sunlight to come through. If we compare those 2 against each other by dividing 7 by 3, we find that SPF 30 is a 233% increase in the blocking power of the sunscreen we're wearing, which obviously sounds much more impressive than the 4% from earlier we were looking at. You could even flip that equation itself around and look at it from the perspective of 30 versus 15 to say, well, 3 divided by 7, we can see that SPF 15 is only about 43% as effective as SPF 30 sunscreen. Now, the question here is, which one of these numbers do you use and which one's the most relevant? So we've got 3 different numbers we can work with here. We can say SPF 30 blocks 4% more sunlight than SPF 15. Doesn't sound very impressive. We could say that SPF 30 is 233% as effective. It's 2.3 times as effective as SPF 15, which sounds much more impressive. Or we could say that SPF 15 is around about 43% as effective as SPF 30, which is somewhere in the middle. So we've got 4%, 233, and 43%. And the question is, which one do you use? The interesting thing about this is that these numbers are all correct. Every single one of these numbers is right. They're all factually correct, and there's no misjudgment here. There's no miscalculation. These numbers are all presenting something to us in the form of information. And we have to use context to figure out which one we want to use and define the narrative we actually want to explain to others. Contextually, you can think of a few different ways you may want to use some of these. The first one, SPF 30, I can see most of you jumping on the third one. I quite like it as well. The SPF 30 blocking 4% more of sunlight, that may be relevant if you're not planning on being in the sun for very long. And this is generally actually something that does get discussed. If you're only going to be in the sun for about 30 minutes, the difference between 93 and 97% blocking of ultraviolet light may not matter that much, especially if you're not someone who sunburns very easily. So it could be that it only blocking 4% more of sunlight is actually very relevant, and you don't need to go down the road of SPF 30. But if you are planning on being in the sun for hours and hours and hours in a given day, or if you're in an area of the world where the sun's particularly intensive, such as Australia where I live, then that 233% more effective number is very, very relevant. And generally speaking, if you do live in Australia, I would strongly recommend you wear SPF 30 or 50 if you can, which is even better. And of course, the last one is still useful from a comparison point, but my point is you can present these in a number of different ways, and it will change the narrative of what you're trying to do. Yes, good point in the chat. It is 2.3 times as effective, not 233 times. We're talking about percentages here. Learnings from this. The first one, and this will pop up again later on in the presentation, you should never assume you've interpreted something right the first time. Your number might be correct, but you shouldn't assume you've interpreted it the correct way the first time. You should always look for different angles to try and understand what other ways you can perceive the information you're seeing. Look for different perspectives on it. And the reason you want to do that is because of this second point, which is that your perspective on a situation can qualitatively change the results of analysis. 4% versus 233%, both of those numbers are correct. They are real numbers that's come out from analyzing those two types of sunscreen, but your perspective can entirely change what the outcome of the analysis is. You can choose to believe that it's not a significant difference between the two, or you can choose to believe it's a very different difference between the two of them, but it will change depending on your perspective. To do this, you're going to need to identify the context and goal of the situation you're walking into before finalizing your analysis. This may change as you're actually doing the analysis itself. You might walk in intending to find one thing, but then find that you've actually found something else instead. But the important thing to do is figure out what the goal of your analysis is before you present the final results. Make sure you've aligned what your outcome is with what you're intending to get from the situation in the first place. You do also particularly want to understand the narrative you're presenting. If you are presenting the narrative that SPF 30 versus 15 doesn't matter very much, then make sure you're aware of that when you're doing your presentation. And really think about, is it the right thing to actually be presenting? Is that the narrative you really want to put forwards? As a data scientist, the business that you work with will be looking to you when it comes to understanding the importance of the figures that are being presented to them. It is your responsibility to decide, do they need to see the 4% figure or the 233% figure? And if they see both of them, it's your responsibility to explain the differences between them and help them understand the way they should be interpreting those numbers as well. Critically important. The next example we're going to look at is a fun one called Simpson's paradox. Now, this is an interesting example of something that pops up quite frequently in data science. Not this exact scenario, but things like this pop up very, very frequently in real life. We're looking in this particular chart, which has nothing on it at the moment, diseases and population amongst frogs. I'm getting echoing audio. Shoot me another message if it's hard to understand me, and I'll switch my audio device. So we're looking at diseases in populations of, in this particular case, frogs. So on our x-axis, we have the population density in a given area. Let's say, for argument's sake, that we're looking at a 1 kilometre square space and how many frogs do we find in that given area. So on the low end, we've got 20 per kilometre. We've got 100 per kilometre on the high end. And the diseases is our frequency. So how many diseases do we find amongst these frogs when we sample these populations randomly? So we go out and do this, and we sample about 100 different populations of frogs that we can find. And what we see is a scatter plot that looks something like this. It's a bit all over the place, but you can see there's a wide range of different diseases that pop up in all sorts of different sizes of populations that we managed to find. And if we were to draw a line of correlation here, we'd find that there's a little bit of a negative correlation. So we're finding that as the population of an area for frogs increases, we're finding less diseases or fewer diseases seem to be appearing. That may seem a little bit unintuitive. And the important thing here is that we haven't actually dived further into this data. At the moment, we're seeing a top-level piece of information. You could go to a journalist or your boss and tell them this number and say, oh, we've got a correlation of negative 0.3. And we're seeing that as the population increases, the number of diseases decreases. But per the learning from the last one we were looking at, you should never assume your interpretation of something is correct the first time. We're going to break this data set into two different groups now. The red and green group. So it's exactly the same data set, but now we've got new information, which is that we're actually sampling two different species of frogs here. So it's not just one massive species of frogs that we've sampled 100 times. It's actually two different species of frogs that we sampled about 50 times each. And you can see that they're actually physically distant on this graph here. And if you were to draw lines of correlation here, you find that the correlation actually entirely reverses when you look at these populations of frogs independently rather than as a whole. So looking at these side by side, if you look at everything together, you have a negative correlation. But if you look at the two samples separately, you find they have positive correlations. This is Simpson's paradox. You can find sometimes that looking at the data from one perspective will completely contradict the way you look at the data from a different perspective. In this case, reversing the correlation between a wider group and a subgroup. This kind of thing does happen quite frequently, and there's actually a very famous example of Simpson's paradox, which happened with a university called UC Berkeley. They ran a top-level analysis that found that they had, when it came to genders, so male versus female, applying to their courses, they found that about 45% of males were accepted into courses, but only 35% of women were accepted into courses. So they found that there could potentially have been a gender bias in their acceptance process. What they actually found, though, when they looked into it, was that at a lower level, when they looked at individual courses, that women were actually biased positively in 4 out of their 6 courses. So in 4 of the available 6 courses they had, women were more likely to be accepted in than men were, which suggests that the correlation reversed when they started looking at the subgroups. And the actual reasoning that that correlation reversed was because women were more likely to apply to more difficult to enter courses, the courses that rejected more applicants. So this is the source of Simpson's paradox, which is one of the dot points on this screen here, the very last one. There are often factors that we cannot see or don't understand properly or have no visibility over when we're working with data. And you need to be aware that these can sometimes be sneaking around in the background and you have no ability to even know that they would be there. They can interfere with your results, and it is one of the many reasons you shouldn't assume you've interpreted something correctly the first time, hence the first dot point again. You can correctly receive contradictory information. It is possible to receive 2 different outcomes from an analysis that completely contradict each other and don't make sense together. And of course, the results that you receive are not always intuitive. So you should always be challenging yourself and trying to understand what it is you're actually looking at and find ways that you can break your own analysis to make sure you really get to the heart of what you're actually looking at. Takeaway from this, of course, is, again, your role as a data scientist is to interpret data. We're really talking about the interpret side of things here. Data is meaningless without context. You need context in order to understand what you're trying to analyze in the first place. You need to understand what the data actually means. You need to be able to know which of the numbers you've received to actually present to someone. So that interpretation is very important. And to do that, you need the context that comes along with the data itself. Your perspective, again, can qualitatively change the results of your analysis. You can have two different data scientists in a room who disagree on a topic, despite having identical results from their experiments. And that's because interpretation and context are what matter, not necessarily the numbers themselves. Your ability to explain these topics simplistically to others is extremely important for engaging them. And I would encourage you to grab some examples like the two I've just shown you now, or some others that interest you, that you can practice explaining to other people. I regularly, at least probably once a week at this point, give one of these examples or some of the other ones I like to use to business people who have no interest or no experience working with data in any meaningful context. Business users can benefit from understanding how data works and how your approach to things will actually change the outcomes from these as well. And it's worthwhile being able to explain these very effectively. And it is indeed one of the main ways that you will want to actually engage with business users in general. The last thing to reiterate here is that you really want to understand your own limitations and try to challenge your own knowledge and assumptions. Try to figure out when you've made assumptions about things. Try to figure out when you've limited your own scope of analysis and challenge it a little bit. Always be pushing the boundaries and try to find ways that you can be wrong about something rather than trying to assume you're always correct. Interestingly enough, this will also help you gain confidence. If you accept that you will make mistakes sometimes, if you accept that you can misinterpret things, you're going to become more comfortable and confident in general. And comfortability is something that will come up again later on in this presentation. The second of these two facts, people are natural analysts. So we've just spoken about data being meaningless without context. But now we're going to talk about how people themselves are actually natural analysts. That's everyone, not just data scientists, not just specifically analysts themselves, but every single person who works with data or in a business or anywhere they want. They all are natural analysts. What do I mean by this? Well, I'll use an example of actually doing an analytics project. So if you're given a task, for example, in the food industry to create a machine learning model for predictive maintenance. So predictive maintenance is the idea that you can identify that a machine or piece of manufacturing equipment is going to break or have problems ahead of time so that you can go and address that before it causes major problems. So predictive maintenance is potentially a very valuable thing you could be doing in a business at some point. And a machine learning model is a method that you may want to do this. Now, the first thing you, of course, need to know when it comes to creating a machine learning model is what do you feed into it? The machine needs to learn from information, so understanding what variables actually need to be fed into it is very important. So who do you talk to first? Who do you actually speak to when it comes to trying to untangle this problem of predictive maintenance? I would personally jump straight to talking to the foreman and the operators of the manufacturing floor, the people who actually work with the machinery, and the reason why will become extremely clear in a moment. Talk to the people who are closest to the subject matter that you're talking about. I see we've got machine operator and domain expert in the chat there. Very good indications on that one. You're absolutely right. You want to talk to the people who sit closest to it. If you ask a foreman or someone who works with the machinery, they may tell you one of these things. You might ask them, tell me about these machines. What do they do? How do they work? Do they have problems? Just ask them and get them talking about the situation. They will say things to you like, when it's cold, this machine sometimes seizes. Humidity makes cooking hard to predict. The one down the bottom is sometimes interesting. This one vibrates when it's about to break down. Now, this is information that the foreman or the machine operators have told you, but it's contextually going to give you information as to what variables you should be feeding into a model as well. So when someone tells you when it's cold, this machine sometimes seizes, that should tell you immediately that temperature probably has an impact and it's something you should try and capture as a data point. Humidity makes cooking hard to predict. Well, thankfully, humidity is also measurable. If one of the products is usually causing more trouble than another product, then understanding which products have been fed in and how they work is probably going to be relevant. Things like the last shift of the day is something that you may not think of until someone actually mentions it to you. If the last shift of the day tends to have more problems, that could be an indication that fatigue actually has an impact on this, and so on. For something like vibrations, when a machine's about to break down, this could be anything from measuring the vibrations themselves in the machine to even just measuring noise levels. If people can hear it before it breaks down, it may be that it's making even quieter, more subtle noises beforehand that a human can't actually hear, which you may be able to pick up. The point here is that without realizing it, everyone, whether they work with data or not, does actually perform analytics on a regular basis. When someone wakes up in the morning, they may look at the weather and they'll see it's a hot day today or it's a cold day today. When they go into work and start working with the machinery and they find it's having problems and they remember that they saw the temperature being very high today, they'll draw that connection in their own head and they'll recognize that, hey, maybe the temperature actually had something to do with this. And business people, oftentimes the ones who have very little to do with the data themselves, are often the ones who will actually be able to tell you the most information about any given model that you're trying to dive into. The people are natural analysts. The other side of this coin is that when you're presenting information back to someone, you need to remember that they are going to be analytical themselves about it. You don't need to tell them all the answers. Sometimes you just need to tell them the information that they need to come to the answer themselves. People are natural analysts. So, understanding your role. Your role is to interpret and guide. You need to interpret the context of the business and interpret the data. That's the first thing you need to do. The second thing you need to do is guide the business in understanding both the scenario and the results you've actually come out with. So it's not enough to just simply do an analysis. You need to be able to walk people through it, explain to them how it works, and let them understand themselves how it actually impacts the rest of their business. This will enable everyone that you work with to actually start analyzing results themselves. And this is the very thing that happens when you would set up a business intelligence dashboard or a visualization for someone. You're giving them the tools to start analyzing things themselves. It's very, very powerful if you can achieve this working with a business. So that was understanding your role. That's the first half of the agenda here. The second half we're now going to focus on is people-focused data science, or more clearly, components of successful engagement. So engagement itself. In order to successfully engage with a business, there are really three main things you need to be doing. The first one is you need to be able to effectively present and explain concepts. You need to be able to help a business person understand what is actually happening, both before and after you conduct any kind of analysis. The second thing is you need to be able to identify and involve key stakeholders. Effectively explaining and presenting things is one thing, but of course you need to be doing that to the right people. The right people need to understand what you're doing and understand how it impacts them. The last one is a little bit abstract, and I'll talk about it a little bit in more detail later, but you need to be comfortable as well. There are a couple of tricks for making yourself more comfortable, and it is something that takes a bit of time to learn. But once you achieve that, there are numerous benefits to just being more comfortable and confident as a person. We'll break these down now, starting with effectively presenting and explaining concepts. The main reasons you would want to do this, and while these may seem a little obvious, just humor me and we'll walk through them. The first one is that you'll allow others to analyze data themselves. Exactly what I was talking about before. If you effectively present and explain the work you're doing and explain and present the numbers or outcomes of the work you're doing, it will allow other people to start analyzing themselves. It doesn't mean they're going to jump into an Excel spreadsheet and start throwing numbers around the place and doing correlations and predictive analytics. But it does mean they're going to be thinking about the numbers you've presented to them and tying those numbers back to the work they're actually doing. And that will pay dividends further along down the line. You will also gain support for your results and projects. If you can explain the results of your work very effectively, people will want more results from you. It's as simple as that, basic equation. The other side is that if you are good at explaining the work you're going to do, it's easier for a business person to understand what's going to go into it and allow you to do it. If you have a good project idea, or an interesting way of approaching a topic, if you're able to explain it well and present what you mean by it, you're much more likely to gain support for being able to actually do it. You'll also be providing confidence in your role and approach. Now, this one is incredibly important, and it's not always immediately apparent why. The confidence in your role and approach isn't just about someone being confident that you're going to be able to do the work. It's also giving them confidence that they can stop thinking about it. And that stopping thinking about it is really, really important. If you're working with someone who sits at the executive level in a business or someone who manages a whole domain of a business, there are a lot of things on that person's mind. They are responsible typically for dozens of individuals. They're responsible for multiple streams of work. And in many cases, they need to report both to people at a lower level than them and a higher level than them, either on the rest of the executive team or to a board of directors or to someone else who's keeping an eye on what's going on in the business. And the more you can do to reduce the mental load on them, the easier your life and their life will be. If you can provide them the confidence that you're going to take an analytical project, understand it, work through it, know the context, and then be able to present it back effectively, then they are going to be willing to release that from their own mind and start thinking about other things instead, rather than trying to micromanage the work that you're doing. So it will save them time and brain power, and it will allow you to focus on what you're doing without someone trying to constantly inject themselves into a piece of work you're trying to do. Very, very valuable to provide that confidence. That will come up again when we get to the be comfortable section. How do you actually do this? There are a few different ways to become a more effective presenter and explainer. A couple of these, again, will be very obvious, but it's always worth going them down so you've got completion. First things first, practice with your friends. It can be very embarrassing, but seriously, just grab a friend and take turns picking a new topic that you haven't worked with before, understanding it, and then explaining it to each other. So pick a topic with your friend, you both pick one, something new to each of you. You spend a day going and doing a half hour of research on it, trying to understand what it is. And then the next time you meet up, you just take turns trying to explain to each other what you've learned, and make sure you listen to the other person so you can provide feedback as well. The feedback is the most important part here. Without the feedback, you're not going to understand what you're doing poorly and what you're doing well. It's very, very important to try and address the negative points of your presentation and explanation style so that you can improve it. That will help you with your confidence, but it's also obviously a practice aspect as well. The more you do something, the more comfortable you're going to become with it, and simply the better you will be at it as well. Practice is always the way to go about it. Along the same lines, you want to start taking all the opportunities you can to explain concepts that interest you. And I don't mean take the opportunities you can to do presentations, though of course I would recommend that. I mean just explaining anything that interests you. Most of the time, people will be willing to listen to you if you're talking about something that you are passionate or interested in. It could be the sunscreen example if you're into that. That's what it is for me. I like talking about fun little interesting issues and problems with data science that can be very confusing and unintuitive to begin with. So don't be shy about sharing those with someone, even a business user. You might think it's not that important to them, but most of the time you'd be wrong. They'll be interested to hear what you have to say about some concept, and it will give you invaluable practice for actually going to the effort of explaining it. It'll also make you less shy about explaining these in the future as well. And as we established earlier, being able to explain these things and being comfortable with it is extremely important. You'll also want to watch other people explain and present and learn from what they are doing well and what they're doing poorly. So maybe you're listening to me right now, you'll be picking up some things that I'm doing okay, some things that I'm not doing very well. Try to think about what those things are and figure out whether you're doing them as well. Try to improve your own explanation and presentation style by watching other people do it. Really, really think about what you're actually doing. That's all it comes down to. So practice and think about what you're doing and take the opportunities to explain the concepts that interest you. You will gradually, over time, become a very, very effective presenter and explainer of topics. Extremely valuable. We've spoken about presentation and explanation. We'll now be talking about identifying and involving key stakeholders. Now, there are a couple of points in this one that are extremely obvious, but there's one in particular that's not very obvious, which I do want to talk about. The benefits of involving and identifying your key stakeholders are pretty clear. You will know who to speak to the most to get outcomes that you actually need. The stakeholders are the ones who will be driving projects and pushing things forward in any given business. So it's very important that you know who those people are so that you can keep them abreast of what's actually happening and be able to get their feedback on what you're doing as well. Importantly, tying back into the idea of context, you must understand what your work is actually going to do to other people. You need to know who your work impacts and how they're actually going to use it in the context of your data. And in order to do that, you must, of course, know who those people are and involve them in the process. That's another very important reason to identify and involve your stakeholders. You will also gain very invaluable support and feedback. The support comes from them knowing what you're doing and understanding how it works, along with being involved in it in the first place. If someone's involved in a process, they're more likely to be invested in it and give you the support you need to actually get it done. And the feedback is, of course, very important for making sure that what you're doing is actually going to be something that's useful to other people. You'll also be allowing those who use your results to actually know more about it ahead of time. So you're not just surprising them with some analysis that you've been doing for the last few weeks and they didn't really know anything about it. Maybe you spoke with them every few days and they've been with you along the journey of you actually doing this analysis, which means when it comes down to showing them the results, they're going to grasp it immediately, which reduces the time for them taking on board the results of the work you've done. To actually do this, some of these, as I said before, will be very obvious, but there's a very important top one here, which is not as obvious. You do want to look for people who are passionate about change or data or innovation in any given business. These people do not need to be senior executives. They do not need to be managers. They don't need to be in any position of power whatsoever. They just need to be passionate and interested in what you're doing. At the end of the day, every business you work in is a group of people. It's not some amorphous magical system that operates on its own. It's all about people working together, understanding what they need to be doing and trying to get things done. So anyone you can get in contact with who's passionate about change or data and maybe interested in what you're doing is someone you should try to keep into the loop. That's because they will then talk about it with other people they work with. They might explain it to their stakeholders, or at the very least, you're bringing awareness to the rest of the business of the work you're actually doing and helping to build some of that excitement. Additionally, they're going to be the people who are most willing to give you information that may help you with the work you're doing. If you involve someone who's passionate about data in an analysis you're doing, they may be more willing to help you pull the data you actually need in. They may be more willing to explain to you how a certain structure of data works or how it interacts with a certain area of the business, things that might normally be a little bit difficult to understand. So don't dismiss anyone who's passionate or interested in data just because they're not necessarily in a position of authority in the business. The next one is extremely obvious. You do want to ensure that you are in contact with the heads of your project area. Whatever you're working on, whether it's something internal to your own team or if it's for another team in the business, you need to make sure you know who the heads of that team are, the ones who actually organize and conduct the business of that team. And you need to meet them. You need to talk to them about what it is they're actually going to do with the outcomes, whether you're making a machine learning model or you're analyzing something or just pulling a bunch of disparate data sets together so they can start looking at it all in one place. Whatever you're doing, you need to talk to the people that are actually going to be using it. So while it is obvious, never forget that you should always be trying to contact people who are in charge of whatever project area you're working on is. And lastly, or possibly lastly, I can't remember if there's a fourth dot point here, you want to take the time to explain what's happening and how it works. This ties back into the explanation from before and it's all about getting that support. Take the time to step people through what you're actually doing and how it's going to impact them. Partly from a practice perspective, partly from a support perspective, them understanding what you're doing means they can help support you on it more effectively, but also to reduce that change management for later. Help them understand what's happening now so that when it happens later, they're not surprised and they understand what it actually is ahead of time. It will make the entire process of deploying analytics in business much, much smoother and more simplistic. There was a fourth dot point and it was to seek feedback regularly. Again, fairly obvious, but it is something that's easy to talk yourself out of doing if you're a little bit concerned that you're behind on something. If you've got an analysis to do and there's something you consider to be a dumb question, you think you should already know the answer to, but for whatever reason you don't know the answer to it, go and get that feedback. Go and understand the answer to that question. Go and understand what you've done wrong. Don't sit there and try to work past it and block yourself off from actually giving the best analysis you can. Most of the time, people are willing to give you the benefit of that. And data is very complicated. It takes time to understand what it is. No one's going to look at you funny for asking you a lot of questions, even if some of them are a bit simplistic about the data that you're working with. Always seek that feedback and don't be afraid of looking foolish to anyone when you're doing it, because it is the wise person that seeks feedback constantly. It is unwise to hide it and never seek that feedback. So that was identifying and involving key stakeholders. Now, you're obviously getting a trend here, which is that these three dot points do interrelate with each other. So identifying and involving your key stakeholders has a little bit to do with effectively presenting and explaining the concepts of what you're working on. And effectively presenting and explaining your concepts, of course, relies on you being able to do that to the right stakeholders. The last one of these is very important, being comfortable. It's a bit of an interesting topic, and I would love to talk to you about it for about 2 hours, but unfortunately, we've only got about another 10 or 5 minutes to talk through this one, which is okay, because this is about the end. Benefits of being comfortable, before I talk about what it actually means to be comfortable. You'll be less stressed. That's an obvious one, but it's always worth pointing out. Being comfortable instills confidence in others. So I'd like to point out that I'm not suggesting you be confident. That may take some time, but being comfortable will help other people be confident in you. If they see that you are comfortable and not stressed, they're not going to be too concerned about the work output you're doing. And additionally, if something does go wrong, they're going to be less inclined to make a big deal out of it because you are comfortable with the situation. Your comfortability will have a tangible effect on others around you and help them be more confident that you can deliver what you need to deliver. As I mentioned before, it can also allow others to mentally offload things to you. So if there's an executive who doesn't want to be thinking about data every second of every day, it can help them, if they're confident enough in you, to just give you the task to say, I need you to go and look at this data set or analyze it or help me understand what's going on with this whole system of data. And I'm confident enough in you to do that. So I'm going to stop thinking about it now. They've given you the task and they've offloaded it mentally from their own hands. That means that they're going to be thinking about it less, which saves them time and stress. And it also means they're not going to be hovering over your shoulder to make sure it's being done correctly every step of the way. And you can seek feedback at your own pace. Incredibly valuable to be comfortable and instill that confidence in others. The last one, again, fairly obvious, you will approach your work with a clear head this way. If you're less stressed and you're more comfortable, you are going to make less mistakes. You're going to be more likely to challenge yourself. And you will, of course, be more likely to identify when you've misplaced your perspective on a topic or you lack the context of something per what we talked about earlier. Actually being comfortable is a bit of a different question to answer. It's really about being comfortable with your limitations and what you can and can't do. So there are some practical examples of this I'll get to in just a second. But it really is just about knowing where your limitations are and not being worried about them. Accepting yourself for who you are. As cliche as it sounds, accept what you can and can't do, know where your limitations are, and just be okay with it. That's really what it comes down to when we talk about being comfortable. To do this, you should always be clear and honest with yourself and with others about what you can and can't do, or when you do or don't know something. If you're talking to a business person or anyone in the world realistically about your area of expertise, do not try to imply that you know what you're doing 100% of the time. Do not try and tell people that you are always right and that you know the answers to everything. You'll be putting yourself into a corner and you'll be worrying yourself constantly that you'll be found out and that people suddenly realize you don't know all the answers to everything, because no one knows the answers to everything. You have to stop and accept that there are things you will not know, you will make mistakes, and you may not always be able to do something immediately. Just be comfortable with that. You will be able to work through it. That's the key part. If you put the time into it, you'll be able to learn the thing that you're missing, or you'll be able to do the thing that you currently can't do if you just practice at it a little bit. And it starts with just being honest with other people. I guarantee you, no one will look at you like you don't know what you're doing if you're always honest with them. The second of these, of course, very related, is to recognize that it does take time to learn and understand these situations. You do not need to beat yourself up over every little thing that happens. If someone starts talking to you about a new topic, don't be stressed that you don't get it in the first half hour of talking about it. When I'm working with businesses, I typically have to have at least 2 sessions on a major topic before I start to be able to really explain what's going on in it and understand it. The first session can be context setting, where someone first walks you through something. They might put an Excel spreadsheet up on the screen. They might show you screenshots from a database. They might show you the results of some analysis they've been doing before. Or if it's a business person, they might just show you a PowerPoint presentation they presented last week that had some numbers in it. And it may be very confusing to start with, and you're going to ask a lot of silly questions, but that's fine. And you may need a second session next week to talk about it again and run your ideas by the person. That's also fine. They will get that. You don't need to be worried about constantly knowing what's going on and not having the time to properly get acclimatized to something and understand what's happening. Last one, again, very related. Do not hide when you failed something. This one is a trap that it's very easy to fall into. It's easy to feel slightly ashamed or worried that others are going to be looking at you like you've failed horribly. If you tell them that you've made a mistake, if you've accidentally missed your deadline, you're late by a day or two, or you've realized that a number you presented to someone yesterday was wrong, or that your code is incorrect and someone else spotted it in a code review, whatever happens, whenever you fail, don't hide it. I'm not saying you need to go out there and tell everyone at the top of your lungs that you failed. Just don't try and hide it when you're talking to someone about it. Be very upfront and clear about it. This has 2 very, very important effects. The first one is that you're getting yourself used to failure. You're understanding and accepting of yourself that you are allowed to fail things, which will make you more comfortable and confident as a person. The other one relates to other people. If other people see you accepting your own consequences of failure and being upfront and honest to them about when you succeeded or failed at something, they will be significantly more confident in you as a person because they know you're not hiding anything from them. If you tell them that you're confident that your analysis is correct, they will believe you because you don't hide it from them when it isn't correct. When you've been wrong in the past, you've told them and they know that. So they will believe you more likely when you actually try to present something important to them. Additionally, because they're used to you being more upfront and clear about these things, they're not going to get on your back about it when you have failed something either. If they know that you can fail things and that you're just very upfront and clear about it, they're more likely to simply listen to you when you explain what you need to do to actually resolve it. You'll be able to tell them, this didn't work out, but here are the steps I'm going to take to fix it now. And they'll believe you because you've just been honest with them. You've been upfront about it. It sounds very simplistic, but if you just do these three particular things, you'll start becoming much more comfortable as a person in general. And it's obviously very important for analytics, but really this is just general advice. Being more comfortable is something you should always be trying to achieve. It goes hand in hand with confidence, both with yourself and with others as well. That's the end of the presentation here. So I'll just quickly recap over the points we've talked through. The first was the two facts I mentioned at the start, which have underpinned everything we've spoken about here. Data is meaningless without context. It means nothing unless you understand what it's for, who it's for, and where it sits in the grand scheme of things. People are also natural analysts. Other people are always looking to analyze things, whether they realize it or not. And your best asset as a data scientist is other people and the information that's rattling about in their own heads. Approaching the data, you want to always be aware that your role is to interpret and guide the business users. You want to interpret what's going on and then guide others in that same understanding and help them along the pathway to becoming analysts themselves. Your perspective can and will change the results of an analysis, which underpins the importance of understanding the context. You do not want to assume you'll interpret something correctly the first time. Very big mistake, and you'll catch yourself time and time again if you constantly do this. Just assume there's another way to look at something and try to look at it from a different angle. You may end up being correct the first time, just don't assume you are the first time. And you do want to understand and challenge your own knowledge. Know that you are stopping an analysis earlier than you could have. Know that you could be diving into it a bit more. Know that you haven't fully looked at every single possibility in a given scenario. Know that you may be missing something. Know that there's an area you aren't very familiar with that you need to read up on. Understand what you do and don't know and try to challenge it when you're given the opportunity to do that. And lastly, a recap on the elements of successful business engagement. The first was effectively presenting and explaining your concepts. The key takeaway from that one is to practice this where possible, referring back to the notes from earlier. Identifying and involving key stakeholders. The main reason for that is to gain support and context for the work you're doing. And lastly, being comfortable, which is mainly to instill confidence both in yourself and others. If you can do these three things, you'll be extremely effective at engaging with businesses and keeping them along the track of any work that you happen to be doing. Obviously, this isn't all completely unique to data science, but it does very, very heavily interact with being a data scientist. Thank you for listening. That's the end of the presentation section. Please do send me messages in the chat if you've got questions. I think there were a couple in there, which I'm going to throw up onto the screen at the moment, so I can start answering them. We'll be finishing up at 3:30, so we've got a solid 12 minutes to go through on this one. There was a question in the chat from Bhupesh, which is how to cope up in time-critical projects. That's a very good question. Coping in time-critical projects. There are two potential ways to look at this one, and both of them involve talking very heavily with these key stakeholders who are actually relying on the work they're doing. One of the things I find is most useful is having a very upfront conversation with them if you're encountering difficulties actually meeting your project's deadlines on time. Don't try to hide it. Don't worry about looking like a failure or feeling like you're going to be lashed out at for doing it. You might be, but that's an indication that your manager isn't very nice. Get the information up to them. Give them the information they need in order to understand what's happening and leave it in their hands to make some decisions on that front. Don't accept the stress of knowing that you're behind time on a critical project when it's a group effort. Your manager or whoever is actually going to be using your analysis or output is in the project with you. They might not be working side by side with you, but they're in it and it's relevant to them how the project is going. And ideally, it's in their best interest as well to help make sure you're comfortable with the work that you're producing. So I try to talk with your key stakeholders on this particular front. The other one, in terms of time criticality, it really depends on critical for what reason. If it's critical because something will break in the business at a certain point in time and you need to be prepared for that time, that's a problem. And it could be a sign that you need extra support or help from others. in order to actually deliver the project. Again, worth talking to stakeholders about. The other side is it may not actually be that critical. A lot of the time people imagine something's very important because it fits in with their own timelines. But if you dig down into it, you find that, well, it's only important because that's the time they wanted it done by. And you could actually have it pushed out by a few days or a week if you need to. Don't be afraid to suggest changes to timelines. It will not always work if you, as I said before, you may find yourself having an unfriendly manager at times, which is a different story to work through. But assuming your manager is reasonable, they will be very comfortable having this conversation with you. Scrolling down a little bit, there's a lot of thank yous in the presentation chat here. I really appreciate it, guys. Any tips on those who are new to analysis? Yes, definitely. If you are new to analytics, there is one tip I always give to everyone. Jump online, find articles and blogs about any topic that interests you, whether it's AI development, neural networks, visual intelligence, BI. If you're interested in databasing, look that up. Whatever's interesting to you from a technical standpoint, dive into those first, look at articles, start from there, and then go into the detail afterwards. There are a couple of really important reasons to take it from that perspective. One is if you're interested in it, if it's something that actually interests you as a person, you are much more likely to be motivated to keep looking into it. There's nothing worse than deciding you're going to learn a new programming language or dive into a new area of analytics and then finding out that you don't like it. You jump into it, you start looking at it and then find out, I'm actually not enjoying this very much. You lose the motivation to start working on it properly. So find the things that are interesting to you first and start at the high level. Start looking at blogs, articles, and anything else about what's going on in the world around you with these technologies. What you'll find is you'll start getting little inklings and tidbits of information about how these people have incorporated these in their day-to-day work or what the new research is happening in some fancy area. And you'll find areas that you can dive into in more depth. You'll read an article that talks about a specific type of neural networks, like adversarial networks are very interesting. If any of you want to Google that at some point. Adversarial networks, you might read that term in an article and you might decide it sounds very interesting and start looking into it. You'll land on Wikipedia. You'll land on, you could land on a student's blog post that only 10 people have ever read. It's amazing where you'll actually land if you start looking into these things. And you'll start learning it very quickly. Of course, from that point, you may want to start picking up some tutorials and doing some coding examples, but it really does just start with that general interest and trying to dive into the things that interest you the most. It's your interest that will keep your motivation on the topic. How important is having the domain knowledge when working with data? Absolutely critically important. You don't personally need to have that domain knowledge yourself to start with. You can walk fresh into a situation that you have no idea about. I've just started working at Patties Foods this last month and a half. It's a lovely place to work and I'm really enjoying it. But I have not got a lot of experience in fast-moving consumer goods. I haven't worked very specifically in food production in the past so much. So you would think that maybe this is a big barrier to entry, but it really isn't because everyone knows that. I'm not hiding it to anyone. I'm not trying to suggest that I am an expert on food production. So I'm allowed to ask silly questions sometimes in meetings and ask how a certain thing works. I'm allowed to ask what an acronym means that I've not heard before. Just be upfront with what you do and don't know and try to gather the information you do need as you go along. You don't need it all at once. Just try to pick up what you need to know to do the analytics you're actually working with. Academic projects won't help to switch to a data science role. So you're looking from where to get experience at a fresh level for data science. So similar to before, I would recommend looking at some articles and examples. If you're having trouble finding articles that you're interested in actually, or if you just want more exposure, do try to reach out to other people who work in this space. You'll find that some academics have come from industry, so it can be worthwhile asking around and seeing if anyone's actually worked in the real world or not. But other than that, you can also just ask them, do they know anyone who works in the real world in one of these environments? You'll find that people are generally very friendly. So if you just reach out to someone on LinkedIn and ask, hey, can we have a 30-minute chat about data or analytics or AI or whatever it is that you want to talk about? A lot of the time the answer would be yes. Someone will be happy to talk to you for about half an hour. You can get a lot of insight doing that. What are the best practices in interpreting and analyzing data when complexities like Simpson's paradox are at play? That's an interesting one. The very first thing as I said, that you want to do before is never assume that you've interpreted the right way the first time. If you've at least got that in your mind, you're much more likely to realize when you've encountered a situation like this before. In terms of the best practices, it's always a good idea to look at more than one metric, no matter what you're looking at. So if you're looking at correlation between two variables, which is what we were looking at with Simpson's paradox, don't just look at correlation. Break that correlation down into subgroups. Try to understand the statistical significance of that correlation. Try to feed in other variables and see if they interrelate with each other as well. There's that very common saying, correlation does not equal causation. And while there's a lot of meaning behind that, one of the takeaways from it is you shouldn't just rely on correlation on its own. Similarly, you shouldn't rely on any one particular metric on its own. If you run a machine learning algorithm and you're trying to test whether it works or not, don't just look at the accuracy measure, which might be 80%. Try to understand what forms that 80%. 80% of what? Is it very good at getting the right answer, or is it really good at not getting the wrong answer? Because both of those can contribute to a good accuracy score. Try to find more than one value that helps support your hypothesis or theory that you're working on. If you've got more than one value, ideally 2 or 3, it's much more likely that you're interpreting a situation correctly than if you just had the one the first time around. Any specific inputs for transitioning to being a data scientist from a different role? Yes, other than the advice I've just given before, that's all very relevant. Another thing you can do is, of course, just tell the people you're working with. This isn't always possible depending on your current role, but if you're in an office environment already, maybe you work in marketing, maybe you work on the supply chain side of things, whatever it is that you're doing, you may be not as far away from data work as you think you are. And indeed, a lot of the work you do might actually have data underpinning it. Most areas of a business nowadays have at least a person or two who has a big spreadsheet in Excel where they do data work. That's usually the minimum you find in any given team. And often they've got actual reporting from a BI standpoint, or maybe a dedicated analyst, or there could be an analytics team in the business that supports the rest of the business. You have to tell people around you that you are interested in moving into the space. Let them know that you're interested. Let them know that you've been Googling new things. Let them know that you've done some tutorials in this space. Offer to take a look at things they're working on. If someone does work on an Excel spreadsheet all the time and you know about it, ask them if you can take a look at it. Just start understanding how it's built, how it's structured, see if there's any improvements you can make to it. These are all the early steps to becoming a data scientist. And interestingly, it's not actually that difficult of a place to move into if you make sure you really push yourself forwards into it. Just ask other people nicely if you can take a little bit of a hand in it, maybe an hour or 2 each week, and you'll be surprised that they eventually lean into that direction entirely at some point. Can I present another example like Sunscreen? I can, but I do not have time, I'm sorry. If I do another talk like this, I'll make sure to include a different one to Sunscreen. They are very fun. I've got a few of those to look through. How can we present cases to senior executives like the Sunscreen case? Well, it's actually very easy. It might seem like you need to set up a really important fancy meeting, and you may need to do a little bit of that nowadays, given that we're in a lockdown COVID environment. But generally speaking, it's not that difficult to actually just start talking about one of these things to someone. Generally, if someone's extremely busy, they'll just let you know and they'll try to move away from you at that time. You can just walk past someone in the corridor and start talking to them, even if they are an executive. They may not have time for you, but it is harmless to try. Unless, of course, that scenario we mentioned before, you may get a bit of a mean manager or mean executive. That can happen. It's unfortunate. But generally speaking, most people are quite friendly. And it is surprisingly simplistic to just segue into talking about one of these examples if you're really interested in it. And that ties back to that bit of advice from before. Don't be afraid to just explain things that are interesting to you. If you're talking to someone and it's all relevant, the data work you're doing, and you're really passionate and interested in it, just spend a couple of minutes talking to them about it. They'll probably be actually quite interested to hear it and really enjoy what you have to say about it. And even if they don't, it's still good practice the next time when you try it again. So don't be afraid to just start talking about these things. You'd be surprised how responsive people can be to these. I'll do the last question now, which will be, how does my day revolve around applying data science at my work environment? For me personally, because I'm the head of analytics, there are 2 different sides of this. One of them is engagement with the business itself. So I do have fairly regular meetings with all the stakeholders that I'm working with. like a consultant or anyone that works in any other business, I have specific projects I'm working on at any one time. There'll be a specific area of data science I'm looking into, or analytics I'm looking into, or BI that I'm looking into. And it's my responsibility to make sure I'm talking to the correct stakeholders about this, per the advice from earlier. The other side of it is, of course, actually organizing those work streams or getting hands-on with it, depending on the circumstances as well. I don't do as much hands-on today, but I still do probably about a third of my week working in the tools at the moment, which I find a lot of fun. And again, it all just comes down to making sure I have the context at the time. I don't work on anything with my hands until I know what it's actually for and why I'm doing it in the first place. It doesn't need to be a complicated reason. It might be just because I'm interested to know how some data looks, or I think it might be useful later. There has to be a reason the first time around. And if you don't have it, then that's an indication that your focus should be on the business engagement side of things instead. I'm not sure how useful it is for you necessarily, because everyone's roles are a bit different, but my day generally does revolve around a lot of that business engagement and combining them with the analytics, and then of course presentation of that to the stakeholders themselves. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I am already a minute over time, and I could continue talking about this for a while. It's been a pleasure chatting to you all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for being here with us today. It was a great session actually, and you gave a lot of business side of insights to us. So it was good to know that what should be the key points while focusing on business side things. So I would like to ask one thing. So how would you suggest, like, we would like, if someone would like to connect with you or follow you, like how should they do that?
LinkedIn is usually a good way. It can be a bit of a hit or miss website sometimes, but generally, if you do just want to talk, or you have questions about how to get into the data science space, or just even a tech question, I don't have all the answers. I'll be honest with you, I'm not the most expert data scientist of all time, but I do actually know some other people, of course, in the industry who may be the right ones to connect up with. Just reach out. Talk to me on LinkedIn. You've got my name. You should be able to find me pretty easily. Just reach out and have a chat. Do that for anyone you think is interesting to talk to.
Okay, great. So thank you, Oliver, for joining us here today again. Wonderful connecting with you. And I would like everyone to thank Oliver for sharing his insights on today. It meant a lot for us to have you here today. So on behalf of Insaid community, I would like to thank you, and I appreciate again that you are here today. Okay. So I'm also sure that the audience might have gained a lot of knowledge. Okay. So
thank you. Happy to be here. It was a pleasure chatting to you all. See you next time.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining us here today. I hope you had a wonderful time learning from Oliver. You can share this video with your friends who can learn more from Business Insight and all. Okay. So also have a great weekend ahead.